Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our seventh Expanded Policy Brown Bag Talk. My name is Jacob Kirksey. I'm an assistant professor in the Educational Leadership Policy Program here in the College of Ed at Texas Tech. We're very happy to put on this virtual Brown Bag series. It's been a wonderful semester, and I'm so glad that you guys have joined us for a rescheduled talk, actually. Our presenters today were originally scheduled to give us this conversation back in February, but Texas froze over, as did most of the rest of the country, so that complicated things. So I'm so very happy that you guys could make time to join us today. I'm just going to give a very quick introduction to our speakers and then turn it right over to them. So first, Hunter Gehlbach is a professor and vice dean at the Johns Hopkins School of Education, as well as the director of research at Panorama Education. An educational psychologist by training and a social psychologist at heart, his interests lie in improving the social and motivational context of schools. Much of his recent focus has shifted towards investigating how social psychological approaches might improve environmental education. Now, prior to joining the faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Education, Professor Gehlbach was at Harvard Graduate School of Education from 2006 to 2015, and at UC Santa Barbara from 2015 to 2019, just enough time to be an invaluable mentor and dissertation committee member for yours truly. Carly Robinson is a postdoctoral research associate at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. Her research interests sit at the intersection of education, psychology, and policy. In particular, she draws on insights from social, psychological, and behavioral science to design and experimentally test interventions that improve social support for students. Some of her recent work focuses on strengthening teacher-student relationships and mobilizing effective family engagement. Prior to conducting educational research, Carly worked as a New York City teacher. She holds a Ph.D. in education from Harvard University, a master's in applied positive psychology from University of Pennsylvania, and a BA in psychology from Williams. Now, Drs. Gehlbach and Robinson complement their applied research interests with a methodological interest in helping social scientists improve their questionnaire design processes, with recent work on enhancing the rigor of educational research through open science practices, which you will hear a lot about today. Working both collaboratively as well as with their own respective research teams, our speakers have published in the leading journals in education and psychology, including Educational Researcher, American Educational Research Journal, and the Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness, among many others. And finally, before I hand it over to them, it's worth noting that they both have quite the track record with awards from the Spencer Foundation, the National Academy of Education, AERA, and the American Psychological Association. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce our very esteemed colleagues to give us a talk today on open science practices. I'll turn it over to Carly and Hunter.
Great, thanks so much. Really appreciate that super kind introduction, Jacob. Very excited to be here for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is now that the freezing in Texas is over, I don't have to worry about my in-laws anymore who are in Houston. So that's one huge bonus. The other is I realized that my tie actually matches my pajama bottom. So lots of big upsides for me today. As Jacob mentioned, I sort of host a smattering of roles. I'm the vice dean at Johns Hopkins. I also direct the Ph.D. program there. So if you have any great master's students, send them our way, and do kind of moonlight at Panorama Education, where I'm the senior research advisor. But another huge reason I'm excited to be here is because I'm also just a regular professor, and this is finally a chance to sort of put on that hat. So if you want to accuse me of being a little scattered, I will probably say, yep, that's probably right. But Carly is much more focused. I'll let her do an introduction, and then we'll dive in today. So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, Jacob gave a great intro, so not much more to say there, except that I think, as you mentioned, I'm focused on leveraging social support from people in students' lives to improve their educational outcomes. And in addition to some work on teacher-student relationships, which you'll hear a little bit about today, I'm also been doing a lot of work around tutoring recently, which I think is really interesting and timely given everything that's happening in the world. But happy to chat about that at any point. But I'm going to start to share my screen and we're going to get started. That looks good. It's off to you, Hunter.
Great. So I think our big aspiration for the day is to not talk too much and really set the stage for a conversation about what we kind of imagine as the changing tides in education research. And that's, we're talking specifically about open science practices, which are sort of a set of norms and guidelines, which are designed to really open up more transparency in the research process. And our, of course, unbiased view is that we think this is really going to profoundly change the field. So there's a ton to discuss. We have tons of questions. I'm sure you will have too. And so we'll try to set up that conversation relatively efficiently, really by doing kind of two main things. So first, I will kind of take you through the story, not so much the story of how we discovered pre-registration. And by pre-registration, I mean this practice of publicly posting your hypotheses and specifying exactly which analyses you're going to do ahead of time, so that you're really, you have to follow through on that in the published paper. So we'll talk more about that in a sec. But the story, not so much of how we discovered pre-registration, but how we really experienced it, because I think, at least from our perspective, that becomes a really important piece of the puzzle. And so that story will then we'll use to foreshadow the rest of this kind of suite of open science norms and practices. And so then at that point, I'll sort of hand off to Carly. She'll put this pre-registration story into a bit of a larger context of how we got interested in open science practices more generally, and I'm not totally sure how this happened, but somehow this put us in conversation with people and landed us a massive pile of work, guest editing this special issue of Educational Psychologist, which actually the timing for this talk would have been great to do it in February, but turns out to be pretty good because it has just come out within the past week. So with that as the big picture framing, I will say, please interrupt and ask questions if and when you have them. Happy to turn this into much more of a conversation. I can't quite see everyone on my screen, so feel free to just kind of interrupt and blurt out. But with that in mind, let's set up this conversation and let's begin it right here. As Carly sort of advances to the next slide, you'll see this bike, a fine autumn day. My daughter's about 3 years old, and I take her and her best friend out for a bike ride. And I hear the following conversation as I'm sort of huffing and puffing there in the front. So my daughter says, "I like ice cream." Friend says, "I like ice cream." My daughter says, "I like blueberries." The friend says, "Yum, me too. I like chocolate ice cream." My daughter says, "I like chocolate ice cream also." You can kind of see where this is going. The friend says, "I have a dog. I like my dog." Now it gets a little bit interesting. Ever since she was about age 2 and a ferocious looking pug jumped up on her in an excited and licking frenzy. I think, Carly, if you advance, you'll see the ferocious pug in question. My daughter is like petrified of dogs. So what does she do? She says, "I have a pet frog. I like my frog." Friend says, "I don't like pizza." My daughter says, okay, now my daughter is just lying. Friend says, "I don't like blueberries." So she changes her mind. My daughter says, "I don't like blueberries anymore either." So kind of weird story, but my mind latches onto this because I think it is just a powerful example of how important similarity is, right? So like, why are you even friends with someone at age 3? Like, you're all in preschool, you sort of sit around in the same circle, so tell the same, reports on what happened at home and what you ate for breakfast. And so like, why is this girl her best friend? And I think this is an important insight is that similarity and realizing stuff you have in common is a really important piece of relationships. So they connect around stuff they have in common. I get excited about this. As soon as I'm off the bike ride, I go back home, I sort of tear through some literature, and lo and behold, the literature has this sort of the social psych literature has a strong research base on the connection between similarity and liking and relationships, almost to the point of being too good to be true, it seems like. So I get to thinking like, gosh, what can we do to stick this in a bottle and deploy it out to teachers and students to improve teacher-student relationships? So get really excited about this idea. We figure out that one thing we can do is to kind of slant, you can't really make two people be more similar to each other, but we can slant people's perceptions to what they have in common. So we figure out a get to know you survey that does exactly that. And then we can kind of cherry pick those things that a teacher and their student have in common and report that back. And so we get excited about this. We run that study with the get to know you survey, the feedback, and I'm going to gloss over a ton here, but you'll see on the next slide, you know, we get a lot out of this study. It's really exciting. So first, one of the things we get out of it is we try out this new technique called pre-registration. So again, we didn't know how to do this the right way at the time. But we wrote out exactly the 6 hypotheses we wanted to test, the analyses we wanted to use to test them. And so that really kind of structured how we then went about looking at our data. Like we had to look at hypothesis number 1 and then hypothesis number 2 and so on. So we find that 3 out of 6 of these hypotheses worked. So we got sort of mixed outcomes for similarity, for teacher-student relationships, for students' grades. Pretty good results on the similarity front. That kind of worked as we expected. Teacher-student relationships, not quite, but it was close. And then students' grades, midterm grades didn't work out at all, but final quarter grades, I think, did. The headline finding, though, the thing we're really excited about, was kind of off menu. Like it wasn't one of the pre-registered hypotheses. Instead, it was an exploratory analysis. And we look separately at the underrepresented minority students. And lo and behold, for those guys who are in the treatment group, they get this huge jump in their grades. Their teacher-student relationships look a lot stronger. So we get really excited about this. Clearly, there's a ton we still have to figure out. So big future directions around trying to figure out exactly what the intervention is doing and how it works. So we write this up, we publish it, and get excited about sort of like figuring out more in terms of what is making this intervention work so well. And so this is, you know, except for skipping over a lot of the details here, this is like a pretty standard story, right? Some new people come in, they're giving a little talk. They talk about the research that goes well, not the research that doesn't go well. But just to, you know, clarify and manage expectations, the lovely story of the intervention that worked flawlessly is not the story we're going to tell today. So onward, replication. Who does that? So this is the part of the story where a, you know, starry-eyed graduate student named Carly Robinson sort of walks into the lab, not, needless to say, the hardened postdoc who you now, hardened and perhaps jaded, who you now see before you, because we thought this was really good. We thought this was going to work, but we perhaps should have taken a clue in terms of replication. Like very few people do this. So in psychology, the most recent work, which is a little dated at this point, and I do think psychology is getting better, but you know, they're replicating only 1% of the studies in psychology. It's even worse in education. I don't think there are any particular hints that we're getting better about doing these replication studies. But needless to say, we try out a ton of different attempts to replicate this original sort of birds of a feather finding that we got. So the postmortem, we try all these replications. They, by and large, fail left, right, and center. We get a couple hints of making teachers and students feel a little bit more similar, but on average, nothing ever approaches this, very exciting finding where we're closing the achievement gap that we had found, again, in an exploratory analysis of that original study. And so why is this? What's going on here? Well, so we do find as we look back to that original study, we do find that both students and teachers feel more similar as per our pre-registered hypotheses. And we do, it's right on the margin of significance, but we do find this bump in quarter end grades. But then we get non-significant findings for kind of the critical piece of the story. Like, we thought this intervention was going to improve teacher-student relationships. We don't find that. We don't find any movement on mid-quarter grades. The effect sizes actually are not huge on any of these hypotheses. And it's not until the subgroup analyses where it all sort of makes sense and all the results line up. It seems really compelling. It matches a lot of these social psych findings that I spend tons of time reading about and being very envious of. The effect sizes are bigger. So with the benefits of hindsight, and this is why I sort of led with this idea that we want to tell you how we experienced pre-registration than how we discovered it. So in the end, I think what happened is we told ourselves a really good story that made sense relative to the other literature about what we found. But there were lots of different potential good stories that we could have told ourselves. And I think we probably ended up capitalizing on chance that was sort of one little pathway through the data and through the analyses that led to this really exciting finding. So with that in mind, and all these failed replications sort of under our belts, we began thinking much more about this pre-registration, because part of the reason we had probably a little too much confidence was because we had pre-registered. So we start thinking instead about, what are we learning from pre-registration? Well, I think it matters how you do it. Like the nuts and bolts of pre-registration have to be right. And this was a first attempt. We did a miserable job on many fronts. I won't go through the laundry list, but as one, quick example, as we'll see when Carly clicks here, we had 6 hypotheses. And if you have that many hypotheses, you do boost the odds that one of them is going to be, just by chance alone, significant. And so we didn't calibrate or sort of control for the number of hypotheses we're looking at. So we walk away from this doing a lot of thinking and eventually kind of realize, gosh, there's actually a lot of these little things that seem to make a big difference once you aggregate them up. So in your exploratory data analyses, and this is, very much a lot of what we read in the field of education, we probably need to be a lot more skeptical of things like, ooh, the big finding was on a subgroup analysis, or their interaction effects, right? That's a cut of your data that allows researchers to try it a bunch of different ways. We looked at underrepresented minorities. We could have looked at, just Latino students, given the composition of the school. We could have looked at free and reduced price lunch. Each of those analyses is sort of an attempt or an opportunity to find sort of significant results. So whether it's that or your treatment of outliers, using sort of less common statistical procedures, and I think often the more complex statistical procedures allow more choices for researchers. We spend a lot of time on survey stuff, and so how you compose your composite variables allows just another set of choices researchers can make. testing out multiple covariates. Let's try mother's education. No, let's try father's no, let's actually try both parents' education levels. Oh, okay, when we control for that, like then we're getting the results we want to see. Whether you set up a few different treatments and, you know, only report some, or multiple dependent variables and only report the outcomes that sort of worked. All these things were things we realized we were seeing a ton in the literature. And it's not to say that there aren't real results on a bunch of those studies, but probably over the course of many of them, at least a handful are what we've sort of taken to calling illusory results. And so as a small bit of compensation for Carly for dragging her through all these failed replications, we were able to publish a piece on sort of our thinking on pre-registration and why it seemed to us like it would be really important for educational psychologists to start thinking about this and start doing it. So with that in mind, I want to take sort of my last couple minutes here before I turn it over to Carly to think about, you know, studies of the future. What is research going to look like in an era where pre-registration is pretty common? And I want to just offer two sort of very quick examples, but I think the big high level components of what it would look like are a ton more pilot testing. So in our lab, we now are doing lots and lots of mTurk, you know, web-based samples where we can mess up a lot and iterate and try it again and get the intervention right. So we're doing a ton of those before we do the much more expensive, time-intensive, get out into schools and, you know, work with actual real ninth graders. I think we'll see much simpler designs is sort of the other forecast I would make about what research is going to look like in an open science era. Oh, thanks, Jacob. I don't, you know, you sit down at this moment when you're going to pre-register your hypotheses and it's like, what covariates are going to make a difference? God, it's hard to know that for sure ahead of actually collecting the data, or at least ahead of analyzing it. So I think we'll see fewer covariates in studies. I think people will just have a harder time predicting that. Probably fewer experimental conditions. People want to preserve their statistical power. And again, it gets really hard to sort of make all these predictions truly a priori. Prioritization of certain dependent variables, you're probably only going to go after the things you think are really going to work. You may have plenty of additional data collection to facilitate exploratory analyses, but long story short, I think simpler designs, simpler analyses to complement those simpler designs. So less in terms of subgroup analyses, interactions, mediation, moderation. It's not that those things will disappear, but they'll just be a lot less common. And then I think we will see, or at least what I think Carly and I hope we'll see, is that these pre-specified analyses maybe have their own results section, and that there'll also be sort of a complementary exploratory analysis section. You know, we're very much pragmatists. It is hard work and expensive to get out into schools and collect data. And so you don't want to limit your data collection to only a couple of key variables, because it'll be hard work to get out there. So people will, I hope, take advantage of a bigger data collection to do some more of this exploratory stuff. But the contrast between pre-specified findings and exploratory findings, I think, will be important for us to understand as the person conducting the research, for reviewers to understand the big distinction there, and eventually for the whole field to sort of appreciate the difference. So with that, I want to give you two quick examples of sort of studies from our lab that have, you know, represent when we got a little bit better at this whole pre-registration thing. So very quickly, the setup for this first one. For a long time, you know, we were interested in getting these sort of student perception surveys out there. I think this, you know, might be even more true now during COVID. for a while, it was like with high stakes attached to it. And would teachers be okay with part of their compensation or their evaluation being based on student perception surveys? So we ask a control group a whole set of questions about that. Are these student perception surveys fair? Are they useful? Do they give you good feedback? Can your students be objective? What do you think other teachers think about this? Is it a good idea? So they walk into our survey and they get that set of questions first thing off. The treatment group gets a slightly different set of questions first. So for them, we're asking, we're not going to ask you about student perception surveys, not yet. We're going to ask you first about surveys in schools in general. And we want to know about you. Can you evaluate your administrators objectively? Would that be fair? What do you think other teachers think about this idea of teachers evaluating administrators? Would it be useful for those administrators? So it's basically the same or very parallel sets of questions, setting up this notion that, like, are you capable of evaluating the people over your head? And then after the treatment folks answer that set of questions, they go back and have the parallel. Okay, so if you think it's generally true that teachers would do a good job of evaluating administrators, what about students evaluating you? And at that moment, it becomes much more awkward. There's a lot more cognitive dissonance to say, oh, yeah, I could evaluate my administrators. I've got plenty of advice for my principal. Oh, but no, my students should not be giving me any feedback. That would be wrong. So that was the premise, that cognitive dissonance would at least give us this little lever. We'd see some differences, and it could open up a conversation around, are you open to using student feedback? And lo and behold, as predicted, and actually as predicted in the sense of, like, in our pre-specified hypotheses, we thought, and we had pilot tested this, that the treatment teachers would be more open to these student perception surveys because we sort of set up this contrast. And so that's exactly what we find. The big takeaway I want you guys to have from this, though, is, again, not a huge effect size, although it's a pretty quick and simple intervention. But the big takeaway is, like, this is a really simple study. I think the editor and reviewer weren't quite ready for something so simple, so it turns into a 17-page manuscript somehow, but I think we could have written it up in like 3 pages. So this is one example of what future research in an era of pre-registration might look like. A second quick example, just to sort of complement this, because I think it's also worth pointing out that it's not that we'll never get interaction effects or moderation effects, those kinds of things. So we do basically the exact same study, but around climate science. So this time the control group has, do you believe in climate science? And the treatment group gets, do you believe in science in general? And so the difference on this study is for and this is a web-based sample. So for our more liberal participants, this is a really stupid study. Actually, can you stay on the previous slide for just a sec? Thanks, Carly. For our liberal participants, it's like, burning fossil fuels. Yes, of course it causes climate change. Do you think climate science helps us understand why it's getting hotter? Yes, of course. So the liberals are basically feeling like we're asking them, do you believe in climate science? Do you believe in science? Like, it's the same. Why should this matter? But for conservatives, if you're in that control group, and it's sort of identity politics at play here, you're immediately kind of feeling a little assaulted because it's this hot button issue about climate change. And so to what extent do you agree? Well, it's a mixed bag for conservatives. But if we first ask conservatives, do you believe in science? And note that these are like really low hanging fruit, like everyone believes these things. Do you believe in gravity, basically? It's really hard not to say, yes, we believe in science. And then when we go back and ask, do you believe in climate science, it becomes more awkward to say no. So now, thanks, Carly, when we see the results, not surprising, the moderates and the liberals, there's no difference, there's no impact. But for conservatives in the treatment group, they do endorse that sort of belief in climate science that, you know, there may be some legitimacy to it to a much greater degree. So again, just another kind of quick example of what things might look like in a world of pre-registration. And so I will stop there and just end by saying, you know, so this is a bit between a kind of a forecast and a preview of what open science might look like what studies might look like in the world of pre-registration, but this is just one of a whole kind of suite of norms and practices. And so I think Carly will now kind of take it away and give us the broader picture of where pre-registration fits into this sort of larger suite of open science norms and practices. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. And so Hunter gave us a pretty good preview of how we came to realize how helpful pre-registration can be and how to actually do it correctly eventually. But after this process of trial and error, it really elevated the need to adopt more of these open science research practices that could increase the likelihood our studies were designed to find credible results that replicate. And as Hunter said, pre-registration is really just one step in the puzzle, an important one we think, but not the only one. And as Hunter mentioned at the beginning, in an attempt to put the pieces together, we just guest edited a journal special issue about what it really means to adopt and adapt these open science practices for educational research. On one hand, many of the articles really illuminated the issues that occur if we are to just let the status quo persist. We call this status quo the old school science practices, and I'll explain how we're defining those in a second. On the other hand, the articles also start to show, you know, what it might mean to adopt open science practices more broadly in educational research. There are a lot of opportunities for increasing transparency, but there are also a lot of challenges that come from trying to do so in an applied field like education. And I think the articles in the special issue really grapple with that in a way that helps put it into context for educational researchers in particular. So I'm going to try to put a lot of these proposed open science practices into context for educational researchers. And first, I'm going to set the stage for why I think we need education to make a shift from these old school practices to open science practices. And when we say old school practices, we're referring to a bunch of well-regarded scientific norms that developed because they seem quite sensible. And Hunter really talked through some of these as he was talking about pre-registration, but things like thoroughly analyzing your data or adding covariates to analyses to make sure you're not missing anything. That makes sense. But over time, as these practices proliferated and more are used in tandem, they're likely leading to some unintentional but consequential problems for researchers, as well as those trying to use and act upon research. So I'm going to give a pretty stylized example of what this could look like and what it means for educational research. So we have these old school practices, which can include thoroughly analyzing data in ways that increase the likelihood that it will result in a statistically significant result, only reporting statistically significant results or restricting access to procedures or data for people who might want to try to replicate it. Not having processes in place to implement successful replications or even replicate measures. The proverbial file drawer where studies that have negative or null results go to die, and using a lot of these practices to add nuances to existing theories in order to, fit the story that the data tells us. And so these are just some of the old school science practices that we're referring to, but what are the consequences and implications of these practices? Well, researchers have been engaging in these old school science practices for decades, which has led peer reviewers to become pretty accustomed to seeing well-behaved and clean findings published in journals. This alters reviewers' expectations of what research looks like, which in turn impacts the incentive structure for researchers as it increases the pressure to produce statistically significant results that fit neatly in a box, because studies that had ambiguous findings or didn't tell a clear story become less likely to get published, which further reinforces engaging in these old school practices. At the same time, because education is an implied field, Our research has implications for practice and policy, but the pressure to produce statistically significant results that may not actually be real make it really hard for practitioners and policymakers to synthesize the research being shared with them, and increases the likelihood that the results won't replicate once put into place in a school or a district, which in the end may lead to a decrease in the faith policymakers and practitioners have in research emerging from education. And so to be clear, this is a hypothetical and extreme example, but these practices are pretty common and they have consequences that extend beyond what gets published in journals. So on the other end of the spectrum, we consider how a shift to normalizing open science practices in education might change the nature of this process or interrupt this process a little bit. In general, the purpose of open science practices are to facilitate more scientific transparency and proactively aim to prevent the pressure to produce illusory results. So in addition to pre-registering studies, the movement really encourages much more openness around analyses conducted and data sharing, and it prioritizes replication as opposed to relegating it as an afterthought. And it opens up many new opportunities for publishing both successful and failed studies. For instance, many journals now accept registered reports, which I'll describe in a bit more detail in a second. And all of which lead to the realization that many of the idiosyncratic theories that emerged from, many of these old school practices working together aren't all that robust. So there may be fewer, but more reliable theories. And so the thought is that all of this will lead to much more tempered and realistic reviewer expectations. It will also hopefully increase reviewers' appreciation and appetite for pre-registered hypotheses and may make them more discerning when it comes to exploratory results, which will change the incentive structure such that it rewards credible results as opposed to just statistically significant ones, minimizing publication bias. On the practice and policy side, the educational research findings will hopefully become more straightforward and help practitioners and policymakers make evidence-based decisions. And as the results become more likely to replicate and therefore become more useful, they may be more enthusiastic about engaging in and using educational research going forward, which incentivizes researchers to continue to produce these credible and useful research. So again, this is a pretty simplified version of what this looks like, but you can see how a greater adoption of open science practices could start to improve the quality and rigor of educational research. So how might we think about adopting all these other practices in educational research? Building on Hunter's showing you the studies of the future, I'm going to share our last version of the similarity study we ran. So it's a little bit of a sad story, the whole failed replication thing, but in the end, it's a happy story for me because I got a publication out of it. But incorporated many of the open science practices that I just talked about and that are covered in the special issue articles. So I'll highlight where you can find more information on these practices in those special issue articles as I go along, for those that might be interested in reading more about them. So the study that eventually got published is basically the study Hunter described, except we ran it at a public university with college instructors and their students. And the unsurprising punchline is that instructors and their students felt more similar to one another immediately, which happened in pretty much all of the replications, but it didn't translate into long-term relational and academic changes as we hypothesized. Another feature of most of the replications we attempted. But the study is published. So why is that? And I can explain in a second. And the study also had to address a lot of the common critiques and pushbacks we've heard from those who are skeptical of adopting open science practices. Things like these practices limit researchers' freedom to discover new and unexpected findings, where this paper covers a bunch of new and unexpected findings that we weren't necessarily looking for. Or that open science practices doesn't really address the fact that education research is real world, messy and has real world conditions that we need to deal with. And we certainly had to deal with it in this study. And often people say that it's just too big of a barrier to getting research off the ground. And I think that can be valid, but I think it really shifts the timeline of when you're doing work and when the work is happening, not the actual sheer amount of work that you're doing. So it serves as an example of how researchers might actually go about engaging in these practices. So in looking at some of the open science practices I talked about, our study was pre-registered. And it was a strong pre-registration. We learned a lot from our trial and error, but also because there are a lot of other smart people who have started to think about this and created processes for making it easier. So Open Science Framework, has pre-registration templates that are very helpful to follow. And I think really one critical thing about this is that we had our original pre-registration, but we actually updated it 2 more times to address things like changes in recruitment and sample size that we couldn't predict and had to edit based on how the experiment actually played out in the field. I made a mistake in the original analysis plan, so I had to go back and correct that when we reposted. So it's not that the pre-registration locked us into making decisions that we couldn't respond to or change, but we had to transparently explain, why we did make those changes. And then the reviewers could decide if that was reasonable or not. We also were, as Hunter said, crazy and proactively replicating a study, which we were motivated to do and did actually receive funding to do so. So there was reinforcement for it, which I think is the key part, and we can talk about that. The timing of our study also worked out well because ARA Open had just issued a call for special issue on registered reports. And so for those interested in learning more, Jonathan Plucker and Matt Makel drive home the need for replication education in the first special issue article. And Justin Reich covers both registered reports and pre-registration in the second. So I'll direct you there for a lot more information and nuance, but they're pretty big pieces of this study. And so like I said, we were able to submit this as a registered report to ARA Open. And this process really allows you to submit your introduction, study design, and analysis plan for review, which really is making a case for why this research study will advance our knowledge no matter what happens. And after running so many of these studies, it really was very well designed and implemented. So the reviewers got to decide whether the results would be worth publishing no matter what the results were. And I'm happy to talk about the registered report experience during the Q&A. I know that Jacob, the speaker series fearless leader, also can speak to it because he had an article in the same special issue. But it's really interesting and frankly helpful process that shifts when the bulk of the work is conducted and when you get feedback, which actually makes a lot of sense for the scientific process. The other thing that we were able to do, and Hunter alluded to this, is to actually anticipate some of the exploratory findings. We were be able to look at with our data set. So in our registered report submission, we were actually able to pitch both our pre-specified and exploratory results sections in advance, although we didn't actually know what we'd be finding in our exploratory results section. And so just in general, as a practice, we try to split up the results sections in this way going forward. So, we are on the hook for reporting our pre-registered hypotheses, but we also can introduce new and novel findings that might be hypothesis generating going forward, as long as we're transparent about it. Notably, ARA Open also requires that you share data in code when you publish in the journal, hence the open. So we knew from the beginning that we'd have to post it publicly. And to learn more about why and how to do this, check out the article on open accessibility in education research by Jesse Fleming and his colleagues. I thought I sort of understood this, but there's a lot more detail and nuance, so I recommend the article a lot. And I have to say that the open data and code culture has really improved my own personal research process as like a extra benefit. My data management and cleaning is so much better because I know I'm posting it for people to see and critique at the end. And finally, because of these different practices, we weren't struggling to make the case that the intervention worked, but only for a subset of students. There were a couple of marginally significant findings that we could have tried to fit in, explain away, but we had pre-registered our hypotheses and they frankly were we had competing results and they were confusing. So we weren't trying to make sense of those results and fit it into a nice theoretical model because honestly, they're most likely just noise. And I think as these practices are increasingly adopted, we'll become a lot more comfortable with noise and ambiguity in our data because things so rarely work out perfectly. And that starts to get to the reviewer expectations that we were talking about before. So this one paper really checked a lot of the open science boxes, and that's in part because the conditions lined up really well. Our funders wanted to fund a pre-registered replication. Our timing lined up with a journal that had a call for registered reports in education. We know in advance we'd have confirmatory and exploratory results to look at. But how do you set up the conditions for open science practices to be enacted in an entire field like education? And I think that's definitely still an open question, but we think that David Meller's article in the special issue is really useful for thinking about this. And he discusses a strategy for changing the culture of research norms. So this requires building the tools to make change possible, making them easy to use, fostering communities of practice, incentivizing ideal behaviors like the funders who are willing to pay for a replication study, and finally making them required if consensus is possible. Of course, this process is not without challenges, and adopting these norms in educational research might be harder than it would be in other disciplines. Just as a first order issue, educational research involves so many different methodologies. So we need to think really outside of the box in some cases about what this transparency means for people. Using big data sets that have been collected before you might be able to pre-register your hypotheses, or people using qualitative methods. And a lot of this has already started. There is a pre-registration template for qualitative research at the Center for Open Science, but there's a lot more work to do on that front. And as I mentioned, educational research is applied and messy. So we just need to be responsive, understand that completely unchangeable pre-registrations aren't realistic. And that's where transparency around a priori decisions or changes to those decisions really come into play. One thing, as educational researchers, we need to think about, there's also real privacy concerns, especially when thinking about what open data sharing means when you're working with private student data. The article on open access in the special issue talks about some of those things and workarounds potentially if you cannot release the data. And of course, there are always skeptics that are going to need to be convinced, perhaps because they haven't been using these practices for their entire career. I've certainly run into a few reviewers who don't see the value in a pre-registered study. And I think it's pretty reasonable for them to want evidence that these practices will actually improve the quality of educational research. I think there's some suggestive evidence that they will, but in the spirit of science, many of these practices have not been tested, and we should think about doing that and be willing to experiment and adapt as new techniques and strategies emerge. And so finally, I just want to tease the last few articles in the special issue, which are really more forward-looking and discuss the implications of adopting or not adopting open science practices for issues like measurement, analysis, meta-analysis, and theory. So in terms of measurement and construct development, Jessica Flake discusses what happens when there's a lack of transparency in measurement development and use, as well as how we can all improve our own measurement practices. Erica Patel writes a pretty foundational article for anyone interested in meta-analysis. She drives home why open science practices matter for the way research synthesis is used in education, as well as the quality of the information that they produce. And finally, Kathy Wenzel's commentary introduces some intriguing benefits and challenges of adopting these open science norms in educational research, in particular, considering the role of theory and what role theory might play in open science, which is very much underdeveloped at this point, and I think a pretty obvious next step for the field to go. So that is really it. I added a link to the special issue here on this to the special issue landing page. All of the articles are open access for a month, so I suggest you go download them now while they're free. And then in the spirit of open access and data and sharing. And yeah, thank you, Hunter, and I look forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Yeah, really apologies if this was a little bit of a fire hose, but we're happy to sort of take any and all questions, even if it's like, go back, say this part again. I want to maybe give, sorry, is it Levi or Levy? First option to kind of re-ask the question that I think came up, Carly, when you were mentioning how you messed up a little bit of the pre-registration on the article that ended up in ARA Open. So Levi, do you want to pose the question you asked in the chat?
Sure. So Carly, you mentioned you went back and filed like amendments to, I think your data analysis plan was one of the specific things that you referenced. And I was just curious, did you have to address that when you wrote it up in the manuscript, or does that all just live in that registration and you kind of get to point the reviewers there and just say, hey, go check out all the stuff that already lives on this other platform? And does that, save you space then in the manuscript to focus on, the heart of the project, or how did you navigate that balance?
So unfortunately, this has happened to me more than once. In one case, I didn't realize it until, I'm writing up the manuscript. And so in that case, I think, referred to it like as a footnote in the manuscript, just saying like, oops, I didn't mean it was supposed to be a fixed effect, not a whatever I put in. And so in that case, I did refer to it. In the ARA Open one, it was because it was also a registered report. In the initial submission, I addressed it, but then for the final submission, they were like, people can refer to the analysis plan, the pre-registration.
But I think it's just it's a great example of like the norms aren't really established. So there's not a sort of right way to do it at this point. And that holds true for a lot of these practices. Do others want to jump in with other questions? Oh, or Levi, sorry, it looks like you have another one. Do you want to go for round two?
Sure. Sorry, this is just fascinating to me. I was curious if either of you could kind of describe what it might look like to try to test the open science practices. You were talking about kind of being open to the possibility that maybe they're just not effective or not the way we want to go. And I could see the point, like for qualitative projects where there'd be some issues to navigate, but if you're in more of a quant project, what does evidence that this is a bad way to do things even look like?
Yeah, so I think this is a question we got a ton as we were editing the special issue and our intro chapter in particular. So we give a couple ideas about this in that introductory chapter, but the couple of things I'll say just quickly, and then it would encourage you to sort of look at the other examples are, it's really hard to like answer this question in the absence of the counterfactual. Like right now, we don't have that many people who have like tried out doing qualitative, like pre-registration for qualitative research. And so we don't know, it's hard to make that comparison in the absence, but in the absence of that, we can look to medicine and we can see when they made that shift to using a lot more of these open science practices. And my favorite little quote is like, thanks to pre-registration, hundreds of medicines stopped working, right? So the implication being they had all these clinical trials that like looked good until they were held to this somewhat higher standard. So we can look to other fields, medicine, psychology is sort of one response. We can look at things that we know should be true. So Bob Slavin, who actually recently passed away, has written a couple pieces with some of his co-authors around the correlation between sample size and effect size. And we know that those should not be correlated, yet we do find that bigger effect sizes tend to come from studies with smaller sample sizes. So there are little hints like that. But to me, the big answer to that question is we've got to like get some data on doing it both ways. And we have plenty of data on doing it in the sort of old school way. Let's get the data on the other side of the equation. And then we can like really do a good job of answering that question because it is an important one.
Yeah, and I'll just add like I think the question is like, is this actually meaningfully going to change like the quality of educational research? And so collecting data, maybe data on journals that have and have not like accepted pre-registrations or registered reports versus that might be a start to see if, the actual research coming out of those journals is better or worse.
Thank you.
And punt it off to Carly while I ponder the second one a little bit more. The big data set thing, I think, is another one of these kind of unexplored spaces that needs to get figured out. And so part of the question is, like, you know, with Eccles K, like, everyone has looked at that a ton, and there are literally hundreds of papers out on it. How could you do a pre-registration that is, you know, sort of has this like veil of blindness on what some of those results are? And so one technique that I've done recently, it's under review right now, so we'll see if it actually sees the light of day or not, is to run you know, basically just sort of our own little pilot study and go through and do a ton of exploratory analyses on the like 2015-16 data set. And then we pre-register, and then we run the pre-registered hypotheses on the 2017-18 data set. And so whether it's that or like, you know, arbitrarily splitting the data set in half to get it, like, what are the right weights? What are the right, you know, sampling procedures? How do I want to know who to include or not? I think part of my answer to that would be like, think about pilot testing. That might be a good way to, you know, sort of just very systematically work your way through all those issues. And with big data sets, it often affords the potential to like wait for another wave of data to come out, which would be ideal, because then it's like, you know, I'm writing up my pre-registration right now for the NAEP 2025 data set. But, you know, that's a long ways away. If you're an assistant professor, you don't want to wait that long. And so there may be other things you can do, like retrospectively going back in data sets, looking at some years, but not others, or splitting the data set in half. Carly, thoughts on the other question?
Yeah, I'll just say to that question, I also think like it doesn't have to be pre-registered if you're transparent about what you're doing. And so you're like, yeah, I'm trying to look and see if there's something here. And then maybe like as Hunter's, then that's used for future hypothesis generating work going forward. I think that's just a big thing that people aren't really thinking about. Just like, let's be transparent about whether this was exploratory or hypothesis confirming. As for your second question, I actually had to deal with this. And because I worked with Hunter and another faculty member who did pre-register studies, I was working on a team that I took the liberty of creating a pre-registration for a project and giving it to the faculty, senior faculty member. And she was like, no, what is this? We don't do this. And I was like, what? So it was like a pretty awkward situation. But I frankly stopped working with her. But I think there are small ways, like a lot of people that work in open science, I know a lot more than I do, talk about not letting perfect be the enemy of the good. So there's a lot of open science practices. So are some more easily adopted by a lab, something like open data sharing or open code or something like that, whereas like pre-registration might take longer.
Yeah, and I would just add, and I'm going to try and sort of fold in Jessica's related question about sort of culture change. I think one of the things that a number of the authors in the special issue do a really nice job of is saying, like, think about what's doable and start with that. And so the doable, like to me, the most doable thing is preprints. Like, you can get your paper out ahead of schedule because there are, you know, edArchive is this great place to say like, hey, you know, we've got a new study out, would love some comments on it. It's not published yet. So, you know, check in with me before you do citing it of any kind. And so like very few sort of senior faculty members who, you know, sort of grew up not doing that are going to object to it. Not everyone. Some will say like, no, it's going to corrupt peer review process. But figure out sort of what the right tolerance level is. But I think the one other thing that I'll sort of layer into that big idea of just figuring out what's doable and taking baby steps and the foot in the door kind of stuff is not all pre-registrations are equal. So there are some sites that are very like simple and straightforward, and it's like 7 questions. And so maybe that kind of a pre-registration they'd be more open to than the like super rigorous OSF, Open Science Framework pre-registration, which is like 26 questions, each of which have multiple sub-questions. And you don't have to answer all the questions. So offering up to a faculty member, hey, I don't know if all of this will make sense, but are there a few of these things that we might do? And if you kind of go in with the like least objectionable things, then, you know, over time you might be able to nudge people to at least have it on their radar screen. So, but it's, yeah, I don't know that there's a right answer on that one, but thank you. Great question.
All right, well, we are at time, but anyone want to ask one last lingering, burning question?
I would much rather field questions and go off to the meeting I have to, so please.
I can ask another one. How do you see this getting infused into graduate school coursework when you think about teaching quantitative methods or those type of approaches? Like, what are some practices that you think should be embedded in those courses?
Yeah, good question. Carly, why don't you start out, since you were in grad school mildly more recently than I was, and then I can talk about it too, since I'm working with the PhD program.
Yeah, so I think, and I think about this a lot because I sort of got lucky to like stumble into to work with faculty who are working on open science, or incorporating open science practices into their work, but that doesn't seem like the right way for this to really, change norms. So we actually, the special issue, we sort of wrote with an eye towards like, oh, this actually could be sort of like some foundational articles for graduate students to read who are interested in these topics. And we actually had, we added what we called a junior scholar review process. So we had like early career PhD students, master's students, actually at the same time, the senior reviewers were reviewing the article, review each of the author's manuscripts and like flag things that weren't clear or like were jargony, because we really wanted it to be accessible to such a wide audience. The other thing I will say is that I think it really depends on the faculty in grad school programs. And like I did not have it as part of my grad school training, like formally, but since then, a lot of faculty have adopted that. And so people are learning about pre-registration and, intro to stats and things like that. But I don't know, how do you get that like formally done across all grad programs?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about it very egocentrically with respect to the Hopkins program, and we're in a great position because we've got a couple key faculty members who are, Matt Makel just joined our faculty, Jonathan Plucker's on our faculty. So we've got like kind of the right team. And so I feel like we're going to be a really good guinea pig to try it out. And the things that we're thinking about is, this is literally like I was working on this yesterday. I want to try and get rid of our comprehensive exams because, that's kind of going over content and you forget that over time, and replace it with a sort of like first into second year project that has to be a replication study. So in their sort of research landscape course, I want the final product of that course to be like, submit a pre-registration plan for the replication study you want to run. Then they've got a second course in the second semester that like sort of walks them through the data analysis that they would do for that study, which they would have pre-registered. And sort of that kind of training, I think, has a lot of potential to, you might reject all these practices like after all is said and done, but at least you've tried them out and know what you would be rejecting. And so, that sort of very experiential way of like having students do this is what I'm tinkering around with right now. But if you guys have other ideas, like, I'd love to hear them, because literally I am in the throes of this right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think our program is similarly situated in that we have 3 core faculty. And so we do have a lot of autonomy in thinking about how we want to build these things into our program. I also saw the eyes of our students light up when you said getting rid of comprehensive exams and replacing them with a study. So don't get excited. But I love that idea. And I love the idea of making it much more hands-on and practical, and weaving that throughout the coursework. And I would love to see us think about how to do something similar with our program.
Yeah, well, let's stay in touch about it, because I'm always happy to be the guinea pig. And so would love to, let you know what we're learning about what I did right and wrong, and kind of benefit from your experience too.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This was so fantastic, Hunter and Carly. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I work with several graduate students on the call who their eyes lit up throughout the entire presentation, so that warms my heart a lot. And so thank you again for being here. And just a reminder to everyone else on the call, hopefully it's on your calendar, but we have one more talk in this series for this semester, and it's next week. We're going to be hosting Michael Little on May 4th at the same time. He's from North Carolina State. He's going to talk to us about early childhood education policy. So thank you again, Hunter and Carly, and thanks for everyone else for joining us. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel, so check it out in case you forgot. And then there's lots of links in the chat. If you haven't already seen them, you might want to click those before the Zoom call ends. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for having us. Great to meet everyone.
You all.